there's really a couple of skills that are really important in negotiation. The number one skill is, well, I actually start backwards. I think the number one mindset to go into a negotiation with is curiosity. And I think it's that real interest in understanding the other negotiating party, to figure out where they're coming from, what they're doing. So that's sort of the mindset that you need to bring in to be an expert negotiator. And then the skills that you need to have are asking really good questions, knowing how to formulate questions, knowing how to deal with questions that get information when you need it, that confirm information when you need to do that. And then, of course, if you're going to ask the questions, you absolutely need to have amazing listening skills. And that's probably one of the hardest parts of negotiation, is just being a really good listener.
Talking with the experts.
Hello and welcome to Talking with the Experts. Talking with the Experts is about all things business by business owners for business owners. I'm your host, Rose Davidson from rosedavidson.com. I specialise in online event management and podcast mentoring and training. And in this episode, I'm speaking with Nicole Davidson of Nicole Davidson Negotiation. And Nicole is a conflict resolution and negotiation expert. She's been working with clients to improve their business outcomes for almost 10 years. She not only teaches the skills, but puts them into practice in her consulting practice and as a commercial mediator. Her work has covered a wide range of industries in both the for-profit and for-purpose sectors. Welcome, Nicole, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Rose. It's absolutely a pleasure.
Yeah, so tell me, how does one negotiate in business? What makes it, why is it so imperative?
Well, I think it's imperative because almost everything we do in business is a negotiation, whether it's dealing with your clients, working out the terms on which you're going to do work for them, whether it's dealing with suppliers, whether it's dealing with staff, or even if it's when you get home at the end of the day and you're dealing with your spouse and your children. All of these conversations are negotiations. And I think one of the things is we often don't think of some of these smaller transactions as negotiations. They're just conversations, but they are negotiations. And the thing is, most people are just never taught how to negotiate. So it's all a bit trial and error.
Yeah. So what's the guidelines, I guess, to negotiation? I mean, there's got to be an A to a Z sort of timeline or process.
Yeah, look, absolutely, there is a process. And one of the things I do is work with people to share that process and help them work through it. But fundamentally, I base things off a model that came out of Harvard University. And it talks about the 7 elements of negotiation, and it breaks the negotiation down into 7 core pieces that you can start to think about. And just that 7-step, those 7 things alone are a great starting point for how to very quickly improve the quality of your negotiations.
All right. Do you want to run through briefly what those 7 steps are, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one of those is relationship, which is looking at, have you got the right people in the negotiation? How are those people feeling about each other? Are there challenges in the relationship that need to be addressed before you can even negotiate effectively? Then you have communication. Are people actually understanding each other? Are they listening properly to understand rather than listening to respond or listening to find the errors only? Then you get into what's at the heart of it, which is understanding interests, or what's really driving people. And I talk about this being the difference between what somebody tells you they want and really digging down to why is that so important for them? What does it give them as an outcome? You move then from understanding their interests, you can come up with a whole range of different options that might be satisfactory to one or either of the parties, and doing a bit of a brainstorming process so that you're getting the most valuable option. One of the problems is often we just take the first one that's acceptable to the parties, but if we worked a little harder, we'd get actually better outcomes. We then have standards, which is how we're going to justify the various options that we're putting forward. How do we decide what's good, what's acceptable, and what's not? Then we have alternatives, and this is another one that's really critical, is knowing what are you going to do if you can't get a successful outcome out of this negotiation with your partner, your negotiation partner. What other ways have you got without their cooperation or consent that you could meet your interests? And that sort of sets a bottom line in the negotiation where you might walk away. And then finally, there's being clear around commitments. And, have you gone into the negotiation with the right people who have decision-making power? And if you get to an outcome, have you made sure that it is crystal clear so it can't be misinterpreted? And have you made sure that everyone's got the resources to actually carry out what they've promised to do? So that's the 7 elements in a nutshell.
Yeah, I guess you're right. We do negotiate on a daily basis and don't realise that we're doing it. So, whether it's with your children and asking them, what they want to eat, and you give them choices, well, they're negotiating an outcome, aren't they? So,
Absolutely.
yeah, I guess looking at it that way, I guess it is a negotiation thing. But yes, and you're quite right too that people aren't taught how to do it effectively or efficiently, for that matter. I mean, there are lots of courses out there, but it's probably something that they need to learn from childhood. And I guess the parents don't. Sometimes parents aren't equipped to actually teach those skills. So it's an interesting concept. Now, I noticed that you are a mediator on the Victorian Small Business Commission. So what does that entail?
So the Victorian Small Business Commission is a dispute resolution service that's been set up by the Victorian government to help small businesses. And really, it's in recognition of the fact that where there are business disputes, often they go to litigation, and that's a hugely expensive process. For small businesses, the cost of going to litigation is obviously not warranted all the time. So this gives them an opportunity to take a dispute to mediation before having to litigate. And the mediation process has someone like myself who has an understanding of negotiation and understanding of the legal system, who is an independent neutral facilitator of their negotiations. So in a mediation, I work with both the complaining party and the other party to really understand, looking back into those 7 elements that I've just talked about, helping them understand the real underlying interests of each side so that they can then work out what is an acceptable solution so that both sides can walk away satisfied with the outcome.
That could be a really satisfying part of your career, I guess, to see that the right outcomes are achieved at the end of the mediation.
Yeah.
And congratulations on your recent award too. That's absolutely amazing. She got the Resolution Institute's Award for Achievement by an Emerging Practitioner for 2021. So they're well done. That's quite good. And you also have experience as a lawyer, insolvency practitioner, investment banker, and recruitment consultant. My goodness, you've got a very, very varied career.
It's a very windy career. I keep saying I have a millennial career and a Gen X body. So I have moved around a lot to find something that now is something that brings me great pleasure and fulfillment. And I think, what's really beautiful about it from my perspective is that the legal skills are highly relevant to what I do in the mediation space because I need to understand that legal environment. But I've also gained those really strong business skills from being in an insolvency situation where you really have to understand how businesses work and what's going wrong and what's going to send them down the gurgler. And all of those business skills and legal skills sort of come in to help me mediate really effectively by knowing what are the right questions to ask the parties in the mediation to really help understand what's important to them.
So what are, I guess, some of the errors that people make when they are doing a negotiation, either with a supplier or an employee or a staff member?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And one of the things that I've found, having taught this for about 10 years, is the most common takeaway that people will get from a training program is people become too focused on themselves. They go into negotiation really hung up on what they need to achieve, what they want, and they don't put themselves in the shoes of the other party. So the biggest takeaway, and I think one of the key mistakes, is being too centered on your own interests. If you're going to put something on the table that's going to get agreement, it's got to meet the interests of the other person. And so learning how to get those interests from them, because sometimes people will really, a lot of people think of negotiation as this battle. It's an adversarial process, and I'm not going to share anything with you because you'll use it against me. So one of the things that I work with people is to help them get the skills to actually pull that information from their negotiation counterpart, so they really can work with them to come up with that mutually beneficial outcome.
Well, negotiation is really a compromise, isn't it? I mean, it should be a compromise, not, I think there's got to be a give and take on both sides. When as you say, you've got to put yourself in the other person's shoes, and they've got to put themselves in your position as well.
Yeah. So I think there needs to be that degree of empathy. I would move away from the idea of a compromise to a collaboration, because I think the more people actually share their mutual, their combined interests, the more that they get to know each other, rather than just having to split the difference or come up with some compromise. If you know more about each other, you can actually come up with a solution that's even better than what you would have initially thought of. And that's the place I try to get people to, is let's just move away from this idea of compromise. And a lot of people think that, people talk about win-win negotiations, but often what they're referring to is that, and they often will do, they'll go, oh, win-win. But when I talk about win-win, I'm talking about this collaborative process that creates value. Whereas a lot of people, when you talk about win-win, they're thinking about that mere compromise.
I guess the compromise, you're right. It isn't really the right word to be using. You have to collaborate with each other so that you both win at the end, and there's no losers. It's how I perceive a negotiation. There isn't a loser.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I guess other than the mistakes that people make, what are the good points of a good negotiator?
So I think there's really a couple of skills that are really important in negotiation. The number one skill is, well, I actually start backwards. I think the number one mindset to go into a negotiation with is curiosity. And I think it's that real interest in understanding the other negotiating party, to figure out where they're coming from, what they're doing. So that's sort of the mindset that you need to bring in to be an expert negotiator. And then the skills that you need to have are asking really good questions, knowing how to formulate questions, knowing how to deal with questions that get information when you need it, that confirm information when you need to do that. And then, of course, if you're going to ask the questions, you absolutely need to have amazing listening skills. And that's probably one of the hardest parts of negotiation, is just being a really good listener. It sounds like it should be easy, but it's incredibly complicated.
Yeah, I agree. I think that a lot of people aren't taught listening skills either, for that matter. And they are something that is quite lacking in people's repertoire of skills. So I guess, how can people learn these skills without, I know training is obviously a really great thing, because sometimes if you haven't got them, you need to learn how to use them. So going to a training organisation such as yourself, then, that's the way they learn. But in a broader sense, I guess, how can they pick up these skills?
Look, I think, you can read certain things. If you don't want to go to a training course, there's some great blogs that you can read that will teach you about that. There's a really simple exercise that I do with people that is, I give it to people and say, just keep practicing this one. It's really useful. And it is just to get someone at home, just get a friend or somebody that you know, to talk about a controversial subject that from a perspective that you disagree with. So, I can imagine lots of heated discussions going on at the moment about topical things like vaccinations or climate change or something like that. And the listening exercise part of it is that you have to listen to somebody speak about a position that you wholeheartedly disagree with for 60 seconds, 2 minutes, something like that. During that time, you are not allowed to interrupt or to say anything other than to ask a question for them to explain something more or clarify. That's the only time you can talk. And then at the end, you have to completely paraphrase back what their key arguments were and get some confirmation from them that you've understood their arguments correctly. So it's a pure exercise in having to turn off your judgment to listen and convey the fact that you've heard what they've said. It's really simple, but it's actually a great exercise for practicing switching off that little voice in the brain that instead of listening, you start listening to the brain telling you why they're wrong. So that's a really good exercise just for people to practice at home and help them very quickly develop the listening skills.
Yeah, that's a great exercise actually, because for myself, I'm guilty lots of times of not practicing good listening skills because you're right, because I'm focused too much on I'm right and you're wrong, and this is where arguments start.
Absolutely right.
So I guess, Nicole, have you written any books on this topic or about any of the other things that you've journeyed through?
So I have a book that's available through Amazon, which is called The A to Z of Negotiation, 26 Tips to Improve Every Negotiation. And that's a collection, actually came from a series of podcasts, a series of blog articles that I wrote, which was one tip for every letter of the alphabet. So that's available at the moment, and the next book's in the works at the moment.
Oh, terrific. I can't wait to read. That sounds really good. So it's on Amazon. Was it A to Z of Negotiation?
The A to Z of Negotiation.
Yeah, I'll have to go and have a squiz at that. And so you don't do your own podcast at all? You just like a guest?
Well, I actually have a podcast that is coming out on 1 November, so next Monday, depending on when this gets released. It may have already come out. So I'm just commencing a podcast called Negotiation in Real Life. And on the podcast, I interview business owners, I interview lawyers, I interview business advisors, and they share their real life experience of negotiations. I then unpack some of that around some of the underlying theory to help people connect negotiation theory with practice so that they can take away tips to apply in their own negotiations. So there's 7 episodes of that ready to go at the moment. And as I said, they'll start next Monday and will come out on a weekly basis. So I'm very excited about that.
Yeah. So where can they find the podcast?
So that podcast will be available on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, all the major podcast players, or they can come to my website, NicoleDavidsonNegotiation.com.au, and there'll be a link to the podcast on there as well.
Oh, good stuff. That's really great. Now, have you got any wise words of wisdom to impart with our listeners and viewers today?
I think in terms of negotiation, there's a couple of sayings that I think are imperative, and I never leave a class without going through these. So I think I'd love to share them with your listeners. The first is we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should use them in that proportion. And I think it's particularly important in a negotiation. I think the reason why is because of my second saying, which is when you speak, you simply repeat what you already know. When you listen, you may learn something new. And to me, they are just these beautiful guiding principles for anybody who's negotiating, just to slow things down, listen more, and get better outcomes.
Great sayings. Yep. And something to remember. I'll actually write them down and put them up on my wall.
Beautiful.
All right, Nicole, thank you. I've so enjoyed our conversation today. I learned a little bit more about negotiation skills. So I'm able to put those into practice, and I'm going to go and stalk your book now.
Excellent. I hope you enjoy it.
All right, Nicole, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Rose. It's been a pleasure.
Talking with the experts.